Another phenomena that I wanted to know about was recurring dreams. And ever since I could remember, I'd had a recurring dream in full Technicolor. This was for decades. And I would say 17th century France very strongly came across that's where we were. And it was on rough, gravelly ground. And I was having a sword fight, a duel. And my opponent was far superior and more experienced than I was, and it was a duel to the death. And it seemed to go on for ages until I got tired, and the next thing I know, he plunged his sword in to my side, just below the rib cage on the left-hand side. And as he pulled the sword out, I sank to my knees. And then I fell forward with my face hit the ground. And as I was falling, I thought, so this is what it's like to die. And that was it. I'd wake up, or the dream would just finish and I'd continue sleeping. Sometimes I woke up and thought, wow, that was a very vivid dream, which it was. And it wasn't till many years later when I started to understand the philosophical side of life and life after death, and study this, that, and everything of interest to me in that regard. And it was suggested to me by one of my teachers, Michael Gardner-Jones, that it was probably connected to reincarnation. It was something that happened in my previous life. And that appealed to me, that did, because it's at least given a logical reason why I keep getting the dream. And then I noticed that one day that a birthmark had been with me ever since I was a child, a white patch the size of a large orange under my left rib cage, in the soft spot just under the ribs on the left-hand side, had gone completely. And all I could think was that was where the sword went in when I died, if that was a previous life. But something to think about, and the patch never reoccurred again. It just disappeared once I realised that it could have been a previous life. Interesting. Another incident regarding a reincarnation, I became very interested in that because it solved a lot of problems on this earth, but I'll talk about that in a moment. I was introduced to a lady, an ex-senior nurse who retired, and she did regression to help people with phobias and other things like that. And then she found that she could take people back to so-called previous lives. And I was invited to go along to some of her sessions and study what she was doing. Well, this was in Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, so went over, Patricia and I, and we watched others being, I don't know what you would call it, hypnotised or put under the influence, and then she asked them questions. It looked as if they were asleep in the chair, but anyway, I'll continue. She was asking them, where are they? And they would give an answer. What is happening? What are you doing? Anyway, she asked me if I would like to be regressed to see if she could tap into one of my previous lives, and I said no. I didn't want to. I wouldn't want to know if I'd killed anybody, which I probably have in previous lives. I said that would be on my conscience. But anyway, she persuaded me in a nice sort of way. And one of my weaknesses, I didn't like saying no to people when they'd ask me something. So I went under the influence, sat in a chair, and she asked me to count back from 10 to 0. And the next thing I know, I'm riding a horse across a field. I could smell the steam coming off the horse and chunks of earth and grass and that were flying up from the horse's hooves and really galloping like the clappers across this field. And I could hear the hooves of horses behind me. And when I looked back like that, turned back to look, I'd got about half a dozen or so soldiers dressed in leather tunics and helmets. And they were following me. I was leading them. And we were chasing two people across the field. They were trying to get away from us. And I knew instantly that we were chasing traitors. And I was a captain in Cromwell's army during the Civil War. But we never caught them. They disappeared into the bushes. And then the lady asked me other questions about that life. What year was it? And I gave the year that, and when I looked it up in the books, that would have been correct, the period for the Civil War. She asked my name. I gave my name. She asked where I was born. I gave the village where I was born. And several other questions that proved to be correct when I did the research on the Civil War. And Devizes was mentioned. She said, where are you based? I said, Devizes. Not where I live, where I'm based. And I found out after research that Devizes was one of the epicenters of the Civil War, all that area. Anyway, she said to me, I'm going to take you to your deathbed. And instantly, I was in bed. And she said, come out of your body that you're in and look at yourself and tell me what you see. And I saw myself in bed it looked like an old stone cottage in an iron bedstead. And standing next to the bed was a very large, rotund, obese, if you like to call it that way, a priest with the black circular hat on, and he was waiting for me to die to give me the last rites. That I knew. And I was painfully thin, and I was coughing up blood. I had a rag in front of me, and it was soaked. I would cough every now and it was soaked in blood. And I looked awful. I was only in my 40s as a captain, and I was about to die of consumption. And she said, take me to the moment when you die. So I was talking, and then I just slipped. I felt my head go back, and that was it. I felt the peace and love and everything else come over me, so I knew. And she said, right, I want you to count backwards to another period in that life. She didn't leave me when I was dead, and it's not the done thing apparently. So she said, I want you to count backwards from 5 to 0 and take me to when you were a child. So I did, went back in that life. And then she asked me, go forward, were you married? I said, yes. Did you have children? Yes. What were their names? And so on. And a lot more information that I couldn't check because I couldn't locate, but it was very interesting. She brought me back and snapped her fingers, and I came out of it, but very interesting on things that I checked up about the Civil War. But very, very interesting. And a gentleman that was sitting next to me was the next to go under the influence by Margaret, the lady. And he was a waif and stray. He's about 17, 18 years of age, and he was running in, looked like Middle Ages or somewhere like that, 1500s, 1600s, and he was running and the crowd were chasing him. And he'd been accused of murdering somebody, which he knew he hadn't done, but he was the scapegoat. There was a quarrel and a stabbing, and he was accused. Anyway, they caught him and he got put in prison, sentenced to death by hanging, and the rope was put round his neck and he was pushed off this platform and hung until he was dead. And he said, very interesting, he said, but it's answered a big question. He said, I've always hated wearing neckties. And his wife was there to verify it. She said, he just does not like neckties. And she said, pulling it round his neck and pulling it tight. And he verified that to me. He said, yep. He said, I can't stand it. He said, if I got to wear a tie, he said, I'd take it off as soon as possible. So very interesting. And the more I studied reincarnation, the more evidence there was for previous lives. And it's the only thing that makes sense as to why people suffer in this life, because as you sow, you reap. Karmic law, what you give out, you get back at some time, somewhere, somehow. If not in this life, the next. So you cannot escape, according to reincarnation philosophy, you cannot escape any wrongdoings that you do. There's always payback time.